it's our individual actions and our individual choices that make the difference in our life. And we don't really pay much attention to what has happened to us and to people. We judge people a lot based on what we think their choices are. So help us understand that better from a collectivistic perspective.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about it even in the context of like understanding the gospel as well.
Good.
If that's okay.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, go where you want to go.
So yeah, for sure. Yeah. Cause I think because of what you said, right? Because of the cultural values in the West, particularly here in North America, being rooted in much more of an individualistic expression of life. Now, we've mentioned there's nothing right or wrong about these worldviews, right? But it's easy to impose certain systems of worldviews, especially when we attach that to a religious system that is supposed to be global, that is supposed to be inclusive, that it can become actually an oppressive force, right? So I think when we think about, the gospel being the good news, and in this, 21st century, looking back on the historical context of what makes up American Christianity, I think we cannot ignore the fact that much of our understanding of the gospel here in the US is actually rooted in a long history of colonialism. And this, and even the label of colonialism sometimes gets viewed in a positive light, but the reality of that, these are systems of cultural eradication. These are systems of land acquisition by force. These are systems of genocide. These are systems of forced labor through enslavement. So these are things that are actually also rooted in a very sort of individualistic sense of entitlement that was brought here largely by a European cultural expression. And the reality of that is that the Christian missionaries of that era oftentimes colluded with the forces of colonialism. So when we look at our what makes up the American church today, the majority of our gospel engagement comes from this very individual lens, like you said, personal responsibility, personal choices, and if we can see ourselves as being innocent in this kind of guilt innocence complex rather than a shame honor kind of culture, then we feel like, if we are on the side of innocence, then we have rights to things, we have entitlement to things. I think that's even what shaped our court of law system, right? There's this idea that if I didn't do anything, or if I did something wrong, there's theoretically a system of criminal justice that I can subject myself to and be able to be granted a clean slate when I've paid my debt back to society and be able to rejoin society. Now, we both know that there's even a lot more problems, even with that, our criminal justice systems, but we're not going to jump into that today. But I think I want to focus on the idea that because of these ways of looking at our Christian worldview that's highly influenced by individualism, we tend to only be able to look at the problem of sin in general from a very individualized perspective. So we relate to sin oftentimes only as something that we individually deal with, and therefore we are the primary perpetrators of the sin. And when we do that, what we do is we fail to recognize that there are sort of two sides to the problem of sin. Not only do we experience sin as perpetrators of sin, but there's also people in this world that have experienced life much more as a victim of humanity's sins, right? So, I really, I'm honored that you have chosen to entrust me even with a little bit of your story of sexual abuse and things like that, right? Because oftentimes when sins like that are committed to people, it's being committed by somebody who is in a position that is powerful to somebody who is powerless. So even this gospel that we would like to be able to translate across the board, it's a little more complex than that. You wouldn't articulate the gospel the same way to somebody who is a perpetrator of that sin compared to how you would present that as a good news to somebody that had been victimized by somebody else's sin. And I think this is a part of what we miss all the time when we bring these different cultures together and try to use a sort of one size fits all gospel model to evangelize the world, right? So I one of the recent quotes that I saw by a leader from the Native community that I really respect. His name is Mark Charles. He's also a Christian leader as well, but he recently posted this quote that says, "Western Christianity preaches a hyper individualistic salvation so that it doesn't have to repent from its systemic sin." Man, I can just like sit with that quote for like hours, just like thinking about all the examples of how exactly that has been made evident through the experiences of marginalized people groups across this nation in its history, right? So